Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Paul. My name is Guillermo Vázquez de Velasco, and I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, the academic home of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy. It is my pleasure to be the first one to welcome you to this amazing event, a conference that celebrates and advocates for pervasive collaboration among governmental and non-governmental diplomatic actors. In a recent letter, I wrote that sometimes in my position as dean, it can be difficult to walk that line between the person and the persona. But today, as I welcome you, I am really not challenged by that dilemma. Both Guillermo, the person, and Guillermo, the dean, are totally overwhelmed by grace, the grace of your company here at the Grace School. No pun intended. We're here today because we all share the common purpose of having a positive impact in the world. With that same purpose, about 2 years ago, an amazing group of faculty from more than 20 different disciplines came together to collaborate in the design of graduate and undergraduate programs in applied diplomacy, which recognizes that diplomacy is practiced by people in multiple vocations, from foreign service officers to everyday diplomats. To our students, our future students out there as well, I hope that this conference illuminates a path towards a place of learning, a place of collaboration, a place of empathy, and of course, we hope a place of grace. The wisdom that we bring today around this virtual table is yours to take and to use. I look forward to joining you and learning a lot over the next 2 days. And I want to thank everyone who has made this event possible. I know that it takes more than the waving of a magic wand to make you all appear in my screen. In particular, I want to thank David Wellman, our wonderful director of the Grace School, for his inspiring leadership. Thank you, David. So, welcome once again. Thank you for coming. And as I always say, may the liberal arts be always with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. Well, I'd just like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. On behalf of the students and faculty of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University, I am delighted to welcome you to our conference, Transprofessional Diplomacy, Deepening Collaboration Among Governmental and Non-Governmental Diplomatic Actors. My name is David Wellman, and I have the honor of being the director of the Grace School. In their collaborative volume, Transprofessional Diplomacy, Costas Constantinou, Cornago, and Fiona McConnell crafted a term to describe the reality of how diplomacy is currently practiced. For while nation-state diplomatic representatives continue the vital work of practicing diplomacy as it has been traditionally understood, diplomatic actors today also include business people, scientists, artists, educators, religious leaders, social workers, community organizers, and activists, among others. As we confront multiple transnational challenges, including the global ecological crisis, the rise of nationalism, racial and economic inequality, the fear of religious and ethnic difference, and the manner in which all these phenomena have been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, the need for a deeper level of collaboration among all practitioners of diplomacy has never been greater. Over the next 2 days, this conference will explore the work and the strategies being proposed and employed by practitioners and scholars of diplomacy to promote such cooperation across multiple vocations and contexts. In his 2009 book, Diplomatic Theory of International Relations, Paul Sharp wrote, and I quote, "We should expect private enterprises, civil society organizations, and possibly individual people to engage in more and more diplomacy as they become more influential in international relations. We should want them all to be good at it," unquote. The mission of the Grace School is to train future practitioners of diplomacy across all vocations, as Guillermo mentioned, from those pursuing careers in the Foreign Service to those who want to build bridges in their own neighborhoods as community organizers and activists. The goal of the Grace School is to create cohorts of students with a wide range of vocational trajectories who engage the study and practice of diplomacy together, and in so doing, establish networks that they will take with them as they pursue their respective careers upon graduation. It is this goal that informs the theme of our conference. It is difficult to contest the assertion that we are living in an era with a profound need for diplomacy. This need can be seen in both local and transnational contexts. From the continuing rise of what James Derderian calls anti-diplomacy among nation states, to the growing social, economic, and cultural cleavages in local and regional contexts, diplomacy offers the possibility of an engaged, constructive response. Furthermore, as we face the complexities of the global ecological crisis, or the subsequent rise in human migration and the way some leaders have leveraged fear of difference to undermine international cooperation, we confront the need for diplomatic efforts on a grander scale than ever before. One path toward elevating the effectiveness of such efforts is deepening the level of collaboration among diplomatic actors operating in a diverse array of vocational roles. What then are the requirements for promoting such cooperation and collaboration? How might embracing the assertions of Constantinou, Cornago, and McConnell help us in that endeavor? The 5 roundtables of panelists featured in our conference will explore these questions and many others, and give us insights into the multiple ways in which diplomacy is currently being studied and practiced. To set the stage for our proceedings, in our first panel, we will meet the 3 authors of Transprofessional Diplomacy, who will reflect on their work and the work ahead. In our second panel, we will hear from 3 citizen diplomats, whose bridge building efforts are aimed at promoting understanding and cooperation across boundaries of religious, racial, and economic difference. In our third panel, we will meet a group of diplomatic studies scholars and practitioners who will examine the role of urban diplomacy in our diplomatic present and future, a field which examines diplomatic acts which take place within the boundaries of a single city. Tomorrow, we will host 2 more roundtables, and I hope that you will be joining us for both of those. The first will examine the intersection of diplomacy and the promotion of social justice. And our second and final panel will engage the intersecting themes of diplomacy, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the emerging diplomatic landscape. Before we turn to our first panel, I would like to express my profound gratitude to the many people who made this conference possible. I'd like to begin by thanking Noé Cornago from the University of the Basque Country, who played a central role in the design of this conference and in the identification of a number of the people who we invited to appear as panelists. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Leah Hasdan and Sarah Brown, for all their invaluable logistical and technical work to make this webinar possible. And a very special thanks goes to the students, faculty, advisory boards, and donors of the Grace School, whose energy, teaching, curricular, and intellectual contributions have made our school possible. Finally, on behalf of everyone at the Grace School, I want to express my deepest gratitude to all the extraordinary panelists who have so generously given of their valuable time and wisdom to bring this conference into existence. You have truly honored us with your presence and participation in this gathering. So now it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to invite you to turn with us now to our first panel. And our panel is entitled The Promise of Transprofessional Diplomacy and its relevance for understanding diplomacy's current role in the world and its future potential. So once again, on behalf of the Grade School, I would really want to express my profound gratitude to all three of our panelists, who are the authors of the 2017 volume Transprofessional Diplomacy, which played a central role in inspiring the curriculum of our school. And it is no exaggeration to say we would not have the curriculum we have today without these three marvelous panelists. So before we begin this session, I want to invite our audience members to post their questions for our speakers during our session via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it just a bit to the right on the bottom of your screen. You can tap that and type in your question. And I will pose those questions to our panelists following their presentations as our time allows. So let me begin by introducing our first panelist. Costas M Constantinou, Professor of International Relations at the University of Cyprus, who joins us today from Nicosia. Costas Constantinou's writings engage the intersection of diplomacy, conflict, international political theory, and legal and normative aspects of international relations. He is the co-author of Transprofessional Diplomacy, and his other publications include the books States of Political Discourse and On the Way to Diplomacy. Welcome, Costas. We look forward now to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Well, many thanks for very kind and humbling introduction. I look forward to this event. I think it is great to connect with all of you virtually in these challenging times and discuss topics of mutual interest. And dare I say, vital to how we live, relate, and operate in the global society today. I understand time is of the essence. David asked me to limit my talk to 15 minutes, and I will do that. And David, if you see me exceeding the time, please let me know. And I will proceed with responding to the 4 questions that David sent us in order to reflect for this panel. Of course, I will not be able to fully respond to these questions given the 15 minutes that I have, but during the discussion period, I'm very happy to elaborate where you see fit. Let me get through the notes that I have written. First, in response to the first question that David sent us is, given the concept of transprofessional diplomacy that we have put forward, how do we see these insights helping the field of diplomatic studies, and where does it need to go from here? And I don't know, David, you want me to set the agenda for the future? I might try and do that in 2 minutes, 3 minutes. But I could, I suppose, also start by paying a fully deserved compliment and say that the field needs to go in the direction the Paul University and the Grade School of Applied Diplomacy is going. Of course, you can see this from the other direction as well. That is to say that the Paul is very much in touch with the things, with the way things are going in the field of diplomatic studies. And I think there are 2 trends. And basically, I think we need to support existing trends rather than kind of devise a new agenda. As you know, the first trend, as you already pointed out, with regard to the field of diplomatic studies, which traditionally has been state-centric and foreign policy implementation-centric, we are now moving to the idea that we no longer see professional diplomats, career diplomats, working foreign ministries, resident embassies, intergovernmental organizations as having the exclusivity to practice diplomacy. And this is very much what inspired us to use this term, transprofessional diplomacy, by way of capturing these developments, these complex developments that reflected very much the expanded diplomatic space and intensifying of global interconnection networks and the new possibilities that these unleash for practicing diplomacy in different milieus. So looking at diplomacy beyond the state-centric, the policy, foreign policy culture, I think this is something that we need to enhance. The second trend that is already happening in the field of diplomatic studies is that the field is actually very much already multidisciplinary. It's increasingly multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, not just interdisciplinary, post-disciplinary, some might say, in ways which are very exciting, I think, and very helpful with regard to the development of the study of diplomacy. We don't only have scholars of political science and people working in religious studies like you, David, political geographers like Fiona McConnell. We have a lot of social anthropologists, diplomatic historians, especially new diplomatic history, political ecologists, science, culture, and education scholars. And this has brought in new concepts and new topics, new debates. I cannot, I don't have the time to go through all of them. Maybe I can mention three that I find especially interesting with regard to colleagues in political geography. I'm thinking of the importance of space, diplomatic space. The work of Jason Dittmer, for example, with regard to diplomatic assemblage, how we relate not only towards diplomatic subjects, but objects, and how we think through this multiplicity of agents. Practice theory is another area which is becoming very important in terms of looking at diplomatic routines, mostly of professional diplomats, but also how these routines combine with the symbolic capital that such agents have, produced power relationships and operate within and across different fields. Cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy, there is a lot that is being done in this area, the importance of visuality and how images can be used to produce and disseminate information and knowledge and influence diverse audience, how we need to become literate in this new media in order to understand what is going on with contemporary diplomatic practices. I think this is very important, and these are some initial ideas, brief answer to that question, David. The second question that you pose, my God, this is really huge. Complexities, how do we address complexities, environmental crises, the rise of nationalism, fear of racial and religious and ethnic differences. And basically, you suggest, you ask us to reflect how we believe what is most needed in order to promote a deeper level of cooperation among governmental and non-governmental actors. I think it's a huge question, and as a result, I'm going to give a very short answer. I will say, and I can elaborate, of course, later if you want me to. I think what is needed is not only an understanding that we have common interests, which is something that we traditionally here, especially among liberal colleagues, colleagues of the liberal school that supported the idea of intergovernmental organizations. And of course, identifying common interests is very important, but I think we also need to do that by also actually having a deep understanding of the complexity of coexistence and the need to really find ways of, in many words, cohabiting, enhancing interdependence, realize the difficulty of cohabiting between not only human but non-human forms of life. And I'm sure, David, this is very much things that you are particularly interested in. Let me move to the third question, which I thought maybe I have more to say, partly because this is something that concerns me very much in the context of where I live in Cyprus. And when I use the term, when I have used it, even though I talk generally, my starting point is where I live, and a lot of the thinking before the theory happens in the field as I try to think how we live here, what do we do, and how we relate to each other in the conflicted space of the island of Cyprus. And your third question was about the concept of everyday diplomacy, which you say that this is something that, yes, that we can see as underpinning in many respects transprofessional diplomacy. And you say, David, while you have made this observation as a scholar, as scholars of diplomacy, this concept is less obvious to people on the ground. I think you are very right about this observation. In your estimation, you continue to ask, how do you believe the concept of everyday diplomacy can be most effectively conveyed to the general public in a manner that will inspire more people to approach their diplomatic work with more intentionality and more effectiveness? I think it is not easy. It requires work, it requires interpretation, it requires a lot of clearing the ground, because, in the context of Cyprus, when I see everyday diplomats and I point this out to them, the first thing that they say is, oh my God, no, I'm definitely not a diplomat. You need immediately to, and they put me on the defensive, that I have used a derogatory term to describe their otherwise very worthy work that they do. Because, as you know, diplomacy has a negative understanding, especially the kind of the state diplomacy. The strategic, not just the state diplomacy, but the view of diplomacy that is basically a way of achieving your way, achieving your ends, and on the way maybe saying a few lies if necessary, or evades, being economical with the truth, or even coerce, which is also part of the kind of dark side of diplomacy. We usually present diplomacy as peace, or sometimes some of us might present it as a peaceful practice. But what is peace, and how far is peace implicated with the continuation of an unfair status quo and a system that is already violent? So how do we deal with that? I think this is, how do we get people on the ground to appreciate that? I think the first thing that one can do is to let them know of alternative vocabularies and alternative understandings of diplomacy. So one easy way is to use definitions like the one given by James Dederian, that it's about the mediation of estrangement. There's already alienation. There is always, you know, difference, estrangement, and diplomacy is about that very much. Or the notion of cultural translation, that diplomacy is about actually understanding others. It's not before you proceed with managing others, you need to understand them. And that kind of process is very important. And it takes place at the everyday level, at that more basic level, if you like, or in the context of Cyprus, that it's about conflict management. It's not just about, you know, we have a conflict, but in Cyprus, as some of you who have visited know, in many respects, we have managed to, and I hope we would be able to maintain that, to transform conflict from a violent to a post-violent one. So it's about conflict transformation. If you cannot have a comprehensive settlement, how you create modi vivendi that allow you to allow life to go on, some kind of coexistence. So it's about solving problems, very much about, you know, what Paul Sharp says about negotiation of ambiguous identities that want to remain separate. You know, not everyone would identify themselves as citizens of the world, you know, so how do you negotiate that difference, that gap? So that's the first move, to give them alternative understandings of diplomacy. And then another one that I do in relation to Cyprus is to kind of ask people, okay, what is your understanding? Where does diplomacy take place in Cyprus? You know, where and of course they will mention the official diplomacy, the interstate or the intercommunal, and that is a failure in the sense of not being able to produce a comprehensive settlement of the conflict. And we have a negotiation after a negotiation after a negotiation. There is a certain negotiation mania that does not produce a settlement. So people have become very cynical about it. Once I do that, I often ask people, okay, given that we have an unresolved conflict, how do you operate? Given where you are, given where you live, given the space where you live and operate and work, given where you visit and travel in Cyprus. And then you begin to find very interesting examples and that people themselves come up with. So someone might be a member of a technical committee, for example, on public health. So even though we have a conflict, we also have committees that try to address issues of common concern across the divide. Given health, for example, given the COVID pandemic now, or crime, or other, you know, cultural heritage, reconstruction of cultural heritage that has been destroyed. Or you have people that, oh yes, we meet in the buffer zone discussing issues, ecological destruction in Cyprus. You know, these people are publicizing ecological destruction across the divide, and they have cross-ethnic collaborations through which they advocate for change. This is fascinating, and this is diplomacy. And you know, even simple things like you know, in the midst. David, how much time do I get?
You've come to the end of 15 minutes, but I don't want to
Okay.
you right
No,
off.
I will.
There's
I will.
room for grace here.
No, I will. I will end the third question and very briefly in 1 minute. And if you want me, I can elaborate later. Your third question was about what we can learn from professional diplomats. And definitely we can learn a lot. I think at the same time as we kind of emphasize new diplomacy and everyday diplomacy, I think something that I appreciate very much in professional diplomats, at least you know, those that do their job not just faithfully but adequately, is that they have a nuanced understanding of the environment within which they operate. They never operate, they know both, they know the possibilities that they, you know, they know the other, as we said before, they know they should know the rival or the enemy or the other side with which they negotiate, but they also know the social spaces, both the formal and the informal spaces through which they can get settlement solutions, resolve problems, both the space of the Security Council and the tea room of the Security Council. So it's kind of having a nuanced understanding of the environment within which one operates. I think this is very important. And the second one, and I will end here, that I think is very important, is their ability, something that was mentioned by the Dean as well, you know, the ability to sympathize and empathize with the other. I think diplomats should not simply be advocates. Diplomats who think that they are advocates, that they are simply there to win a case, they are not good diplomats. You know, they are not creating and finding solutions to common problems when even the opposite side makes a demand that you find unacceptable or that you cannot meet. I think a good diplomat should try to offer alternatives, say that, well, look, I cannot accept that, but I can help you solve your problem through this way. And I wonder whether this is acceptable. So these kind of skills that professional diplomats have, I think this is something that everyday diplomats can also adopt and learn from. Thank you very much, David, for your grace.
Thank you so much, Costas. What a marvelous way to get our conference started. So, so now I would like to turn to our second panelist, Noé Cornago, who is an associate professor of international relations at the University of the Basque Country, who joins us today from Bilbao. Noé Cornago's work focuses on the transformation of diplomacy, global regulation, critical sociology of knowledge, post-development and aesthetics and politics. He is the co-author of Transprofessional Diplomacy and the author of Plural Diplomacies, Normative Predicaments and Functional Imperatives. Welcome, Noé.
Thank you very much, Davis. I'm very glad to be here, very pleased to be here to participate in this event, along with my friends and colleagues, Fiona, McConnell, and Costas, and you all. I would like first to express my gratitude to Guillermo, to the whole DePaul University, of course, and particularly to the College of Liberal Arts and Social Science, whose dean is Guillermo. I was very fortunate to participate in the launching ceremony, inaugural ceremony. It was in November, no, past year, and I had very good memories. I was very impressed about not only, of course, how welcome I felt myself, no, with you all, but also about how easily I found, no, that the ideas that Fiona and Costas and me were trying to formulate, no, in our meetings, no, in Rapallo, no, in Italy, in the same place in which in an old-fashioned hotel, no, in which it was negotiated and then signed the Treaty of Rapallo, no, through which Germany, Russia, and who was the third? Sorry, I suddenly forgot. basically was the treaty that welcomes the Soviet Union to the new, to the diplomatic world. No? So it was interesting for me and extremely pleasant, no, to see how, after many conversations with David, because we are friends since a long time ago, basically because we entered in dialogue as well with his book, Sustainable Diplomacy, no? Thanks to Costas' initiative, no? To invite a group of scholars to discuss about David's thoughts about diplomacy. But it was very impressive to me to see how the Paul University and all the faculty and members and departments which participate in these conversations previous to the creation, no, of the Grace School really got the ideas we tried to formulate. And I will say that more than this, they even developed, no, with new insights, with new steps forward in terms of how to really reinvent in some way the way in which we study diplomacy, and perhaps more importantly, the way in which we understand diplomacy as a practice, as a practice which is relevant in daily life and international life. And for that reason, I would like to put the emphasis on this. I was very impressed when David began to share with me the first syllabus you began to draw, no, to grow, no, in the different departments. And I was very impressed to see how, I insist, this transprofessional idea, which is, as Costas has said, is also is a transdisciplinary understanding, no, of any theoretical and practical approach to diplomacy, was extremely well understood and further developed and welcomed by these wonderful faculty members that the College of Liberal Arts and Social Science already has. Beyond this, I would like to make my comments as a sort of conversation more than as a formal delivery of some notes. I would say that with regard to the first question that David posed us about what could be the next move, no, for diplomatic studies, no, I would say that when I entered in the field of diplomatic studies, and more obliquely in diplomatic practice, it was a moment in which diplomacy was very much in need of renewal. It was very much in need of theoretical and practical renewal. And I must say that in my view, according to my experience, perhaps more than scholars initially were practitioners and even professional diplomats, the ones that began in the late 16th and early 70s and in the 80s to express overly, sometimes in their memories when they wrote their books, no, of memories after a life and foreign service, other times in professional statements they did, no, where while they were performing their work, in which they express a sort of insatisfaction with the way in which diplomacy was understood in the mid-60s, early 70s. And this is something that for us as scholars was extremely stimulating, because as scholars, perhaps we were distant from these professional experiences of diplomats, but also sometimes, particularly with three, no, that adopt a quite, I would say, innovative or critical approach, no, to the mainstream diplomatic studies. No, when we began to work, we found, and particularly I found absolutely, that I met plenty of practitioners, plenty of professional diplomats that were, I would say, more open to my understanding of diplomacy than my scholar fellow colleagues were. So I would say that the scholars have been more conservative, more reluctant to change than practitioners have been. And of course, this has been because, or this is because practitioners performing in their professional lives diplomacy were in contact, in direct contact with the transformations of our societies, technological innovations, new political challenges, economic concerns, plenty of things that moved them constantly for their zone of comfort. From this point of view, I would say that the diplomatic studies today should be understood, first of all, as a way not only of studying diplomacy, but as a way of establishing a dialogue, a fluid communication with those performing different diplomatic tasks in the most diverse fields. Some of these fields are, of course, the typical or the traditional international fields in which diplomacy has been performed for a long time. Chancelleries, embassies. But when we go to embassies and we talk with, for instance, with consular officers as well, they talk, they have an understanding of diplomacy which is really different to the way in which diplomacy has been explained and introduced to students, for instance, all over the world until very recently. And it's a feeling which any professional official diplomat is perfectly accustomed to enter in dialogue and negotiation with interlocutors which are not necessarily diplomats. Of course, they talk with each other from diplomat to diplomat. But for any diplomat with a mission, it's extremely important to enter in dialogue with people coming from very different positions, with very different understandings, and of course, from different professions. And the more complex the international agenda is becoming, the more salient is this need. The need to be open to listen other professional knowledge, other ways of approaching an international negotiation, other ways of understanding how an agenda should be built. And this is something that I would say is something that the Grace School has been, I would say, audacious and courageous enough not to afford. The idea that perhaps the time has come for innovating in the way in which in a country like United States, nothing less, in which there is, of course, a brilliant tradition of diplomatic schools in many universities, with a very important Department of State, and to adopt this decision to create a new school for diplomatic training, inspired in these innovative ideas, which are, of course, not our three innovative ideas, no Costas, Fiona, and me, absolutely not, no, but more in tune with what is really the reality of diplomatic tours and diplomatic tasks all over the world. I would say this is very important, frankly. And I would say that perhaps what diplomatic studies will do, and also diplomatic schools all over the world, a little bit, of course, and adapt to the round circumstances, is to move forward, to take this audacious step that the Grace School has adopted, and being willing and able to anticipate to the round students, graduate and undergraduate students, the real professional world that they will encounter in the real performance as diplomats. And of course, the real performance as diplomats, not only they are working for official diplomatic services from different countries or working for international organizations, but also to understand that this training and this understanding is extremely useful and valuable as well for many other professionals working in other very different fields. David has mentioned, which we have had a lot of conversations about this in the last years. For me, it's quite impressive to see that if I enter in the field of social work studies, I realize that social workers are realizing that their work should adopt, embrace this diplomatic understanding, because they are no longer simply functionaries trying to provide social services. They are put in a position that constantly need to enter in negotiations, in very delicate negotiations, in which they realize that they are, on the one hand, representatives of the state, for instance, but also they are in some way representing these people in front to the state as well, when they are trying to bring these voices of these people living in different conditions and need of social support to the public authorities, to the legislative power, to the judicial power, or whatever. And it happens in social work. It happens for instance, in law. It's extremely interesting to see how in law schools, they are realizing more than ever that instead of going straight to the court, no, for a litigant understanding, no, of law, they need to negotiate. Of course, in the United States, you have this tradition since a long time ago, this to negotiate before entering the court, but it's something which is quite new, particularly in Europe, I would say. So I would say that this diplomatic understanding of the law profession is also very revealing about the existence of something which trespass diplomatic profession, and of course trespasses as well other professions. Other question that David offered us or asked us about this is about in what extent, no, some of the skills, the tools, the techniques that diplomacy has forged across time, across historical time, in what extent they may be relevant and meaningful for everyday life. And I mean everyday life, not necessarily, of course, in the narrow sense, which is in itself quite important, or our daily life, our emotional family life, but in terms of a social everyday life, in terms of living in a particular place, in a particular neighborhood, living in a particular city, in a particular country, with a particular work, and these particular things that we all say, which are, instead of particular at the end, we realize that they are really universal. As diplomacy has been for a long, long time, basically a never-ending negotiation of, as Costas has said, no, of coexistence, I would say this combination that diplomacy has of approachment to the other and also distance with the other, this combination between formality of form and content and meaning, this understanding of the being open to an outcome of a negotiation which not necessarily is simply to secure the utility you were seeking, the advantage you were seeking or working for, but being open to learn together how little by little through these negotiations, sometimes even when they look as merely pragmatic or utilitarian, you are able to build a space for mutual trust and confidence and mutual learning. So I would say that perhaps this is the greatness of diplomacy and the transhistorical value of diplomacy, the way in which through centuries and through different civilizations and cultures, even if the human being has been, of course, insisting in fighting and using violence very frequently, but simultaneously across history, the will to try to resolve differences through dialogue, through listening, through the negotiation, has built, I would say, a body of practices, institutions, and also a body of discourses in terms of a particular way of approaching things, a particular way of naming things for being approachable, no, in a mutual conversation. That is something that we are rediscovering in some way. And we are rediscovering this, in my view, because for a long time, but not so long time, basically is an interlude in the history of diplomacy between late or early 19th century and I would say late 20th century. Diplomacy all over the world was extremely centralized, bureaucratized, hyper-professionalized. And it was a moment in which, in addition to wars, we have all the colonial imperial violence. It is a period in history in which, in addition to, of course, very important progresses in terms of culture, technology, welfare, and many other things, but the humanity was encapsulated in this project of the nation states. And these nation states sometimes, of course, were able to negotiate a sort of agreement, a sort of coexistence. But to encapsulate the complexity of social life, the complexity of our relationship with nature, the complexity of technological challenges and innovations, to encapsulate this within a simple system of official representation of the whole populations of a particular country in a single foreign service, is, I would say, impossible. It's absolutely, as a project, was an unfeasible project. It was a project that never could drove us to a good destination. So we are in a moment in which, even, of course, if foreign services of different states all over the world remain relevant, of course they are, but probably in order to remain relevant, and more importantly, in order to recover, to regain significance and relevance, they should be necessarily more open to this plurality of voices, this plurality of actors, the very existence of competing legitimacies. So working with a PhD candidate from Chile, Cristian Obando, which I have been working with him a lot of time, he was on the relationships between, very complex, between Bolivia, Chile, and Peru, and in the triple border they call, what he discovered and we discovered together in some way, that instead of trying to explain this relationship so contentious through the official narratives of the three chancelleries across history, what we need to do was to listen the three legitimacies that are operating there, which is the legitimacy, of course, of the chancelleries, because we cannot forget the importance of nation states. They are not necessarily bad, they have also good things as well. But a second legitimacy, which is the legitimacy of those living close to the border, those that have a real interest in building infrastructures, in facilitating investment, trade, modernization in these areas, and also a third legitimacy, which is the vernacular legitimacy, the original legitimacy in the area of the native nations, which have their own concerns as well. So we need to bear in mind at least these three legitimacies. They are competing, but they are not necessarily incompatible. So I will say that this happens all over the world. In some way, it happens as well, of course, in the border between the United States and Mexico. But within the United States, it happens as well within some cities, which they have their own divides. So this understanding, I would say, should be more fruitful. And actually, in the past, it was already fruitful. Because before this centralization of diplomacy, which came basically in the early 19th century, diplomacy was extremely fruitful through this embrace of this diversity of factors, competing legitimacies, and so on. And I would say, David, that this is all for now, because I really prefer to enter in conversation with all the participants. I am very impressed with the number of people connect right now, 46 people. This sounds very good. And we are eager to listen to them. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful contribution. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Fiona McConnell, an associate professor in human geography at Oxford University, who joins us today from Oxford. A political geographer, Fiona McConnell's work focuses on the development of new areas of thinking regarding governance beyond the state and different modes of political legitimacy. She as well is the co-author of Transprofessional Diplomacy and the co-editor of Diplomatic Cultures and International Politics, Translations, Spaces, and Alternatives. Welcome, Fiona.
Very many thanks, David, for the invitation. And it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with Costas and Noe. They really truly are two of the most inspiring scholars we've got in diplomacy and from whom I've learned so much over the last few years. It's a real pleasure to be here. And the prompt questions you set, David, were really useful provocations and a really nice chance to revisit some of the arguments we made in transprofessional diplomacy. And I thought I'd seek to address the questions by talking through some ongoing work on diplomacy at the United Nations. So focusing in particular work I do with representatives of minority communities, stateless peoples and indigenous groups. So to start with the first question, and again, it echoes, going third always happens, doesn't it? It echoes some of what with Costas and Noe have been talking through. So in terms of where do we go from here with the concepts we set out in transprofessional diplomacy, and I think some of the points we make towards the end of the paper probably still stand in many ways. You know, this call for diplomacy studies to take seriously the implications of a pluralization of diplomatic actors, and also the really rapid expansion of diplomatic space, or what we recognize as diplomatic space. Because I think in order to embrace the kind of multiplicity of diplomacy as a practice, there needs to be a continuation of this kind of diversification of the field of diplomacy studies. In terms of fostering those interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary exchanges from right across the social sciences and humanities, and therefore drawing on as broad a range as possible of both conceptual framings, but also methodological approaches in how we seek to understand diplomacy in as many guises. Or to put it another way, just as diplomats are increasingly having to diversify their practices, and I completely agree with Noe's point that in many ways the practitioners are ahead of the game on this, and they fully recognize the plurality and the transprofessional nature of the fields. So it's kind of our responsibility as scholars to be polymathic in our own approaches as well, and to really embrace different ways of looking at this field. And I suppose I'm a case in point, right? I'm an interloper in the field of diplomacy studies as a geographer. As a field, geography itself hasn't really taken diplomacy very seriously, even in the fields of political geography and critical geopolitics. But then again, not until recently has diplomacy studies taken the question of space, place, spatiality that seriously either. But I think things are beginning to change. I think it helps that diplomacy studies is a relatively small field without a kind of particular canon as such, which means it's the ability to be dynamic and creative, which I think is really exciting. And I think Noe and Costas are just model examples of how open-minded scholars can foster those exchanges across academic disciplines. And I think exactly conferences like this and the curriculum you've got at the Grace School, those are the kind of things that help drive forward this kind of much needed diversification. And I think it's exactly these kind of conversations that are really important to how we might reimagine diplomacy studies in the future. In terms of your second question about the challenges and how we can seek to promote a deeper level of cooperation across state and non-state actors, I thought I'd add to your list of challenges, if that's all right, which is to flag what is a growing crisis of multilateralism within international diplomacy itself. And in particular, we're seeing this played out at the United Nations at the minute. I think the challenges at the UN at the minute are quite remarkable. We've got, over the last few years, an increasing number of states flexing their diplomatic muscle in ways that have challenged the kind of existing liberal international order upon which the UN was established. Case in point that yesterday, Russia, China and Pakistan were elected to the Human Rights Council for a 3-year term. And these challenges then are compounded by the chronic underfunding of the UN at the minute. The liquidity crisis really has put the organisation into turmoil in many ways. And of course, the ongoing pandemic, right, which means that the physical spaces of diplomacy are effectively being shut down at the minute. And over the past few years, colleagues and I have been trying to document the kind of shrinking space of civil society within the UN. So looking at what we've termed kind of bullying and blocking tactics of a number of state actors within the spaces of the UN to prevent other voices from being heard. So whether it's blocking access through denial of ECOSOC status, harassment of non-state diplomats within the spaces of the UN, so interrupting speeches, that kind of thing. State promotion of government affiliated NGOs or GONGOs seeking to counter human rights accounts. And of course, most seriously is state reprisals against individuals who are diplomats, who are acting diplomatically within the UN before, after, and traveling to the UN. And then in recent weeks, we've been trying to look at, well, what's happening under the current circumstances at the UN during the pandemic, how this has impacted particularly representatives from marginalised communities. And we found that members of civil society and kind of minority groups, Indigenous peoples in particular, have had their rights rapidly reduced at the UN since March. And their participation has been curtailed in ways that member states, official observers and NGOs with consultative status haven't seen their rights curtailed, which is a direct breach of Sustainable Development Goal number 16, and of course represents a potential crisis within multilateralism at the UN. So we've seen that the cancellation and postponement of a number of UN forums that directly affect non-state actors. So the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was cancelled for 2020. There's been the postponement of a number of universal periodic reviews and a cancellation of all side events at the Human Rights Council sessions in March, June and September. And those are vital spaces, right, to have that diplomatic exchange that can't be had within the official meeting spaces of the UN. And the cancellation of the curtailment of these kind of forums represents a really significant loss of voice on this international stage, and has really tangible impacts, right? So we've spoken to one representative from the Middle East who described how they wanted to raise awareness of the issue of a particular political prisoner who was due to be executed, but the loss of access to UN forum meant that this individual had been executed before they had a chance to raise that case, right? Now we've seen a shift then towards remote working at the UN. So, you know, diplomats are using formats like this to conduct diplomacy now. And there's been some really interesting stories about how that impacts on the practice of official state diplomacy. But it's also had a huge impact on how non-state actors seek to engage with the UN. They don't have access to technical support. They might have limited internet capacity where they're based. Interestingly, the web TV broadcasts of the UN are only available in English. So immediately you're having the shutting down of the spaces through which diplomatic cooperation and exchange can happen. And there's also really significant cybersecurity issues with using some of these platforms, which limits the ability of minority groups to even feel able and willing to engage within these forums. So lots of challenges then. But at the same time, the UN obviously remains a really important platform for cooperation between state and non-state actors, in theory, if not in current practice. So what we've been looking at is also the potential opportunities that arise from this ongoing crisis in terms of potentially making this a more exclusive and participatory space. Because more widespread remote participation could facilitate more meaningful engagement with a broader range of actors, right? By removing travel constraints, visas, expenses getting to Geneva or New York could increase the diversity of voices and that collaboration across different groups of actors. There's also increased flexibility in online participation, right? You could actually have sessions that run at various times of year, not at prescribed session slots, to therefore address really pressing issues like the ones you've highlighted, whether they're human rights crises, issues around democracy or ecological issues as well. And a shift online also opens up the possibility for an increased youth engagement. And this is something we've been documenting quite a lot, right? In terms of an ability and a willingness to engage with new diplomatic practices. So I think some of those innovations in how diplomacy at the UN could be organized, mediated and practiced has the potential to promote kind of deeper level of cooperation amongst state and non-state actors, even within an institution as seemingly immutable as the UN. And then I thought, because I realized we're rapidly running out of time, I'd combine my response to the last two questions in one, if that's all right. So this was about the concept of everyday diplomacy. How do we express that? And I think Costas and Noe have done a great job at kind of setting that out. And I completely agree. I think the first point is really being more confident in the use of the term diplomacy. I think, Costas, you said, you know, people are shy away of it, there's a lot of negative connotations. I think another reading of that is also people see it as above them, right? Because of these connotations that it is an elite practice. So I think we should democratize diplomacy. And I think a lot more has to be done to dispel the myth that it's the preserve of states and of trained elites. Diplomacy therefore kind of needs an image change in public discourse, because it's an image that is increasingly tarnished given the behaviour we're seeing in elite politics in the world today. So we need to encourage people to appropriate the term diplomacy, to own it and to take pride in it, in calling themselves diplomats or describing their practices as diplomatic. In terms of tools from official diplomacy that are useful, another one to add to the mix that, in addition to those that Costas and Noe have discussed, is the really simple one of being a good listener. Getting doing the groundwork, getting to know your counterparts. Something that I know those involved with what they would term advocacy are usually neglect in many ways. So spending time understanding common interests, I think, is absolutely key, and it's something that trained diplomats are really proficient at. But as well as those tools of conventional diplomacy, I want to end by suggesting that everyday diplomats can also look elsewhere for kind of creative strategies to carve out space in international diplomacy. And here I kind of take inspiration from the representatives I've been working with the last kind of 8 years or so. So, you know, the ability to experiment, individuals who don't have the constraints of a foreign ministry above them, telling them what they can and can't do. Individuals who don't have the kind of ongoing media scrutiny are able to experiment with the modes of diplomacy they engage with. They're able to navigate their subjectivity, right? Switch hats between being a diplomat or an activist or an advocate. And this kind of shape-shifting, I think, allows individuals to draw on a repertoire of different practices from diplomacy and beyond. And I think linked to this is an ability to forge networks of solidarity and support. So I think outside of state diplomats, there is a propensity for kind of large-scale coalition building, the pooling of information and expertise, which I think links back to arguments we made or tried to make in the paper around the notion of kind of diverse partnerships and kind of hybridities between national diplomatic services and a plethora of other actors. And I think paying attention to those alternative diplomatic practices has the potential effect of making diplomacy itself more collaborative, more flexible and open, and therefore bringing to the fore possibilities of generating space for creative thinking within and beyond the field of diplomatic studies. And I'll leave it there.
Fiona, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing together those questions. I regret that we've come to what was scheduled to be the end of our hour, but I'm just wondering, I've received two really marvelous questions that I would like to pose to the group, if everybody's willing to just stay a bit longer. And since I would like to reverse the order now and start with Fiona, go Fiona, Noé, Costas. And I really like this question because it speaks specifically to all three of your contexts. It says, all three of you come from cities, Nicosia, Bilbao, and Belfast, which have experienced significant social conflicts and divisions. In all three instances, the work of building bridges across ideological, religious, and ethnic divides was both necessary and extraordinarily difficult. What is one of the most important lessons about bridging divides that you learned from growing up in these cities, which you think could be applied to the challenges that we are now facing here in the United States and some other parts of the world?
That's a great question, and really perceptive to pick up on our kind of three histories that are probably more in the subconscious in terms of where we've come to this from. What can we learn? I'm going to be quite cynical on this one. And so growing up in Belfast in the 1980s, I don't know that I learned a huge amount about crossing divides and diplomatic communication. And it probably took me moving out of that context and being able to see some of the issues from afar. Even if that move was only across the Irish Sea to mainland Great Britain. And I think distance can be really important in that perspective and engagement in that kind of way.
Thank you so much. Noé.
Very interesting question, David, but not easy to answer. So I will try briefly to make some comment. I must say that when I met for the first time Costas and Fiona in different years, I also thought about this, about because we in the Basque Country for a long time had in mind never worsen the situation or driving the situation so far as the Northern Ireland case was, the Ulster's case was, in terms of polarization and isolation of different communities and so on. And of course, the Cyprus case as well. But in some way, I would say that our situation was less intense, less critical than it was in Northern Ireland or on Cyprus. But it's true that in the Basque Country and in Bilbao in particular, when I was a teenager, the late 70s and early 80s, we really have plenty of violence. For instance, simply in the year 1980, ETA, the Basque independentist terrorist organization, killed more than it was kind of 120. That means that almost every week we have some mortal action, some mortal violent attack. And also state terrorism was very important as well in these years. Not in numbers, it was not so important, but it was something that we really lived with this. And as a teenager, because I always have been a quite reflective guy, I thought a lot about this when I was a teenager. And I realized that it was difficult at that time to try to adopt a position different to those, I would say, going to one or the other side. And even socially was, I would say, as difficult to adopt this position, because you felt a pressure to either put you in a place, in a side or in the other. So I never felt myself as a sort of in-betweener, absolutely not. But I tried to promote a sort of continuity, to identify what could be the way in which the feelings and frustrations and hopes of people living in different areas of the city with different political ideas could try to improve the situation. And I remember that me and a group of friends at the university, we found later inspiration in the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, because the Women's Coalition was the first coalition which really trespassed the social divides, the political and religious divides that the Ulster experienced at that time. So I would say that in some way this it was crucial for me to save this understanding about social conflict and social polarization, about the importance of constant communication and dialogue. But it was so, I would say, so sad, no, this scenario, no, this climate, that only years later, afterwards, I tried to reconnect this with my interest in diplomacy. Perhaps I was interested in diplomacy as a way of escaping from this situation, more than for a will to intervene. And only later, when I feel more confident with my work and so on, I began to be more active, no, in this sort of trespassing, no, between different challenging, no, this polarization at the university, for instance, and in the sport and in the professions, because the professions were also very divided at that time, with different professional associations for lawyers, different professional associations for social workers, of course, different trade unions. So it creates me this concern. And I think that this feeling of living in a divided society, after all, is quite universal. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's extremely intense and violent. In other cases, it's more silent, but it's there as well. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Noe. And now we're going to give the last word to Costas.
Thank you, David. What can we learn, or what have I learned from Nicosia as a divided city? I would say that there is not only one division. It's the recognition that the city is divided in many ways beyond the ethnic division that we have, beyond the buffer zone. And it's a kind of a recognition that I experience more. Unlike Noe, I was not a reflective teenager. I was, you know, I was more in the nationalist, in the neighborhood where I grew up, and the athletic club I used to go and all that was very nationalist. Maybe something I came up later. Maybe when I went to the army, I started being more reflective about a number of things. And when I went to the university and I found out about the other side of the story. But when I experienced really this notion that there was a different division was when I started joining bi-communal meetings. I think some of you, David and Noe, you've been to Cyprus. You remember Lydra Palace, where we had in the buffer zone, we had, well, you came to Cyprus after the opening of the checkpoints. Before the opening of the checkpoints in the 1990s, we started kind of bi-communal meetings between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, the rediscovery of the other, you know, following the division of 1974, and in some places actually even from 1963. So getting into that eerie buffer zone, you know, the divided city, getting into the buffer zone, meeting Turkish Cypriots, and then leaving that space and going back to the city, back to your side, was basically a recognition that there was a different division. The division was not with those that we were presented in the media and publicly that we had differences with, but we had a lot of common interests. We kind of had ways of and ideas of how we could overcome the division. and understandings and solidarities, you know, all those networks of solidarities that, you know, Fiona has mentioned, and all these ways of finding mutually, finding common projects in many ways, over not necessarily having to do with how we solve the Cyprus problem, you know, having common projects and common ideas. And then you realize that there were other problems beyond the ethnic division. There were other divisions, there were class divisions, there were, in the case of Cyprus, also other minorities, other groups of marginalized peoples, and how, and that recognition, I think for me was very important. And I would say that's what I would say is the one thing that I would say is look at how the city is divided in different ways, and what networks of solidarity, of course, you can create with groups across those divides.
Well, I regret that we have come to the end of this time, but what an extraordinarily rich conversation. You've given us so much to think about as we enter into our other panels. And I just want to thank Fiona McConnell, Cornago, and Costas Constantinou for their great contribution to the field of diplomacy, to our conference, and being such an inspiration to us here in Chicago. And I'm so happy that we could meet today in this diplomatic space, this virtual diplomatic space, but I really look forward to the day that I can welcome you all here to Chicago. So to those in our audience, I want you to know that we are going to begin our next panel at 30 minutes past the hour. We're going to take a break now. And that panel, entitled Religion, Diplomacy, and the Work of Building Interconvictional Bridges Across Boundaries of Difference, is going to have three very dynamic citizen diplomats who I hope were listening in on this first panel. So again, thank you so much from here in Chicago, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you.